Hey guys, Dan Pickar here. This is a how-to video, I would say. It's more of an informational video for the MRS section of the Eastmans Hunting Journals and TagHub research. But for those of you guys that don't know, I'm originally from Montana. I spent 25 years of my life in Montana. I grew up in Region 1, up in northwest Montana. I'm going to address two questions today. The first thing is, have wolves ruined the hunting in Montana, and have wolves ruined the elk hunting in Montana more specifically? And then also hunter numbers. There's a lot of talk on the forums and the Facebook groups of there's so many hunters, there's so many non-residents. So we're going to take a little bit closer look at both of those subjects and just look at the facts. This isn't going to be a wolf bash session, so I encourage you to stay and just hear what I have to say. Let's get right into it. So you have the great state of Montana. I'm passionate about this state. I love Montana. It's my home. It's where I grew up. I've hunted all the regions. I've spent so much time from Glacier Park down to Yellowstone, and I just love the wildlife and the culture and the people of Montana. So let's start with hunter numbers. What have hunters been trending to do, and what have hunter numbers been doing specifically in the past, let's say, 10 years? This is where most of this data is published. This is from FWP, and it's reaching back to 2014. And for example, hunter numbers have changed quite a bit. Hunting has become very popular. And so for non-residents, the big, thing is that there's so many non-residents in Montana. We hate seeing non-residents. But the fact of the matter is that there's been 17,000 big game and elk combination licenses for 30 years. And this is, statutory stuff that's been determined by, our state government. So that hasn't changed. There's also 4,600 deer combination licenses as well for the last 30 years. That number hasn't changed, but there's a lot that's changed in the meantime. So the first thing is just the popularity of hunting. So, back in 2010 or even up to 2014, you could just go buy a big game combo or an elk combo as a non-resident over the counter as a leftover. So just these tags weren't spoken for. But now, it takes 2-3 points to be guaranteed a big game combo license in Montana as a non-resident. So just demand has gone up. And so naturally, yeah, there's more non-residents on the landscape because of that. Now, is it a ton? Not really. I mean, a couple thousand here and there, but it's, numbers add up, that's for sure. Okay. So there's a lot of intricacies of tags and licenses, and of course, populations of deer and elk play a huge role on how many tags are allocated. So, with elk tags in particular, it's been interesting because we've seen a vast shift of elk populations and where they're flourishing and where they're not. And I'll get to that in a little bit when I talk specifically about predators, but we're seeing a lot of hunting pressure that's going east, right? So we have all these hunters that are going to the east side of the state because of populations are struggling in the west side of the state. So this is where we come in and we talk about populations and population counts by FWP. And just like anybody from FWP will tell you, it's very difficult to count deer and elk in vastly timbered and brushy habitats and regions, such as Region 1. It's very challenging to count the number of elk. So I'm not even going to go off of that, but now Region 1, there's 2,200 elk in Region 1, and that is up from 1,700 in 2008. So we're seeing a growth in the number of elk in Region 1 on paper. And then this can vary. It just depends on what's out in the open and when they count the elk, so on and so forth. You get the picture. So what has changed is that we can go and we can look at the number of hunters that are hunting Region 1, because you can't argue with physical hunters that are running through check stations. Yeah, you're not going to get all the hunters, but they can get, a pretty good idea of what's going on just based on traffic and harvest and check station hunters. So what we've seen over the last decade is for deer hunting specifically, Region 6 and Region 3 have been the two areas that have increased by 3,000 and 1,500 respectively. And the greatest decreases for deer hunters has been Region 1 and Region 5. Now, these two regions vary differently, so differently because of not only management, but the amount of predators too. And so you just can't overlook the fact that the density of predators are very high in Region 1. And so as populations decline, as there's just less ungulates on the landscape to hunt, hunters are going to leave, right? Growing up, I grew up in the Flathead Valley and in the 90s and the early 2000s. And most of the people, my friends, and everybody traveled to go hunting because there just wasn't a lot of elk to hunt in Region 1. So everybody went down south, towards 2 and 3, or maybe out east, just because the hunting's not very good in Region 1. And so we can see the trend. So in the 10 years, once again, the decreases in hunter effort in Region 1. So let's move to elk. It's the same thing. Region 3 and Region 5 have been the greatest increases of hunters, and the greatest decreases have been in Region 1 and Region 2 by a few thousand, 2,900 and 2,500. So what's that telling us is that hunters are moving this way, or they're going to where the elk and deer are to hunt. Why would I want to go on a walk, 5 miles and see one white-tailed doe, or just not see anything when I can travel somewhere else in the state and see all sorts of animals? So that's how we know that populations are struggling in Region 1. So that's kind of an example, but Montana is 70% private and 30% public. And this is where the problem really begins, because you have these hunters that are leaving, say, from this line right here. This part of the state is vastly public land, Forest Service, and in western Montana. And this quadrant of Montana is vastly private land, with the exception of, some big blocks of BLM around Fort Peck and the breaks over in that area. So what we have are really record numbers of hunters, but they're also vacating these Region 1 and Region 2 areas because the populations are just struggling. The deer and elk populations are struggling. And so everybody's kind of going other places. Like we saw in the greatest increases, Region 5 and Region 3. And so just naturally, over time, the public land that is available in these other regions, specifically out east, are going to seem more crowded. They are more crowded. It's a fact. They're just more crowded. So it's very interesting that we're seeing, big shifts of hunter pressure directly related to deer and elk population numbers. Okay, so this is an interesting part, and it's not going to surprise you guys, but in 2023, the hunter revenue, or just the deer and elk license revenue, and the total hunting license revenue comes from about 77% non-residents and 23% residents. So yeah, so that's not me advocating for we have to have all these non-residents to pay for our budgets, but it's a lot of money that comes from non-resident hunting sales. Total hunting license sales in the last 10 years. This is very interesting. Residents up 39,000 since 2013. Non-residents up 100,000 since 2013, 2014. That's just hunting licenses. That's much more than just deer and elk hunting. Keep that in mind. And we're going to get to a little bit more of that here later. General deer licenses, residents up 4,000, non-residents up 1,400. So you can see the graph here. So it's not the general deer tag sales. That's not where we're seeing the increase of hunters. Okay, general elk licenses. Since 2014, residents up 3,000, non-residents up 1,000. Okay, that's a little bit, but it's not really that much. And there's a dip in 2019. So it's stayed fairly flat. Now, this is where it becomes a little bit more interesting, because now we're at the deer B license sales. And so as you can see on the graph, as our deer populations just started climbing in the later 20 teens, conditions were right and fawn recruitment was very good. We were getting the moisture when we needed it. Deer populations, particularly in the eastern part of the state, skyrocketed. So in result, FWP is going to allocate deer B licenses to try to manage the herds a little bit. So of course, there's more people, once again, on the landscape because of deer B license sales. 21,000 additional residents, 7,000 non-residents. So right there, 30,000 more hunters on the landscape just because of that rise of B licenses coming into 2020. The same kind of is true for elk B licenses. 6,000 resident, 2,000 non-resident. Kind of into the shoulder seasons, and just the increase of elk populations in Montana, particularly in this eastern part of the state, shoulder seasons, the elk B licenses, more tags available. There's going to be more hunters because literally there's just more tags available. It's just management changes. Okay, this one's going to really shock you. I was surprised anyway. Upland bird season license sales. Since 2014, residents increased 30,000. 30,000 more residents buying upland bird licenses. Okay, so those aren't big game hunters, but that's more hunters on the landscape. It's more traffic. It's more people. It's more people signing into block management. It's more people gaining access on private, et cetera, et cetera. 8,000 non-residents during that same time. But that's by far the biggest increase in the last 10 years of hunter pressure, hunters on the landscape in Montana, is upland bird hunting. So that's pretty crazy. That's wild. Okay, so this is an interesting one though. In the last 10 years, resident deer hunters have declined by 4,000. That's pretty crazy. So deer hunting is less popular in Montana. Non-residents, 3,700 on the increase, particularly because of those combination licenses. They're all being spoken for now. There's no leftovers anymore. That's not a thing anymore. So there's more deer hunters that are non-residents on the landscape. Okay, elk hunters on the landscape. A decline of 2,700 residents elk hunting on the landscape. An increase of 3,000 non-resident elk hunters on the landscape for much of the same reasons. So this is very interesting as well, block management in Montana. So we know now that upland bird hunting license sales has what's been the dramatic increase in hunters on the landscape in modern times in 2024. So block management, we've lost 1 million acres in the last 10 years, 900,000 acres to be exact. That's a lot of land and access that's gone away to the public. And so I would factor that in. You hear stories of landowners complaining about, hunters leave gates open and they litter on their land and abuse things. I think that's probably part of it. And I think that's why it's so important to, really treat your landowners well. I'm always leaving a love letter on my block management card to the landowner because I really am that appreciative to them allowing access. Obviously, leaving gates how you find them. Don't drive on wet roads and, through the gumbo and tear up their stuff. I mean, that's ultimately kind of a big deal. But I also think, and this is not a fact, this is just my hunch too, but we see the great migration, I like to call it, in 2020 from COVID of people moving to the more rural areas because of just, the mask mandates and everything that kind of went on. But we saw a lot of land turnover, a lot of ranches for sale, a lot of people from out of state coming in and buying ranches in Montana. And I think, they're locking them up. And maybe that has something to do with the increase in upland bird hunting in Montana on these private ranches, and the loss of the block management numbers is perhaps from the landowners. I can think of one example off the top of my head. I'm not going to say the name of the ranch, but it sold for millions and millions of dollars. And it was a conglomerate of owners that came in, and they didn't really care about the elk. I mean, they went elk hunting and whatnot, but they wanted to grow pheasants. And when you factor in like bird hunting and upland, it's more of like a gentleman's hunt. The guys that maybe are a little bit more wealthy tend to gravitate towards the bird hunting. And so that might have something to do with it. That's not a fact. That's just kind of what I'm thinking and what my opinion is. But there might be something to it. Okay, so switching gears a little bit. This is kind of going to be the last portion of the video. But I want to talk about how have predators and wolves specifically kind of changed the landscape and changed what the elk and the elk populations have done in Montana. The biggest thing that I hear on YouTube or any social media is that, particularly from maybe the opposition or some wolf lover groups or whatever, they say, well, you have all these elk in Montana, the numbers actually increased in the last decade, and there's all these wolves in Montana, so the wolves aren't killing all the elk. And that's largely true, but there's so much more to the story. So in '95, when they introduced wolves into Yellowstone, there were about 17,000 elk in the greater Yellowstone herd. And as quick as 2003, so what is that, 8 years later, that number dropped down to 4,000. So about 75% of the elk gone. And do I think that the wolves killed all the elk? No, that's not what happened. I think the elk definitely weren't ready for that type of predation, especially the large packs. And a lot of them moved up here to the Madisons, and a lot of them moved up into Paradise Valley. And when I was fortunate enough to work on Dome Mountain, which is down here just north of Gardner, Montana, from 2010 to 2012. And I got a good education of what is actually happening down there. And this is just one example, but it's going to paint the picture for kind of what's going on in the rest of the state with the rise of the grizzly bear and the rise of the wolf too. So, elk are leaving, they're moving. A lot of these late season cow hunts, for some of you guys, old timers, or, my first cow hunt, my first elk hunt when I was 12 was a late season Gardner cow elk. That was a cultural thing down there in Paradise Valley and Gardner, Montana, was to go hunt late season elk. And those seasons are gone, and that doesn't exist anymore. But, from the wolf has a great impact on elk movement and what elk do and where they decide to summer and where they decide to calve, so on and so forth. So as populations increase, shifts and movement changes. And on top of this, so what actually happened is, here's some numbers in 2008. And unfortunately, I don't have any tangible numbers that are published from FWP pre-wolf for the entire state. But in 2008, that was the height of the wolf in the state of Montana, because we started hunting them that year. And in 2009, from then on, we've hunted them. So we have elk populations in Region 1, 1,700, Region 2, 17,800, Region 3, 42,900, Region 4, 21,000, 72, 3,300, and 700 in Region 7. So here's the home range of the grizzly bear and the wolf. Regions 1, 2, and 3. That's predominantly where the populations of these predators, and I call it the predator trifecta, because you have the wolf, you have the grizzly bear, and you have lions and black bears. Let's include those too. Because black bears, if you would believe this, are responsible, according to many studies, bears in general, but specifically black bears are responsible to 50 to 60% of calf mortality in the first month of their life. And so that's a big impact. And so when you have all these black bears in Montana, 13 to 17,000 black bears in the state, and grizzly bears, we're at 2,100. There's about 2,100 grizzly bears in the state that live in this greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and they live in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, which includes, Glacier and then the Bob Marshall down here. And so what we're seeing is historic low elk populations into the 2008s and so on in this area in this region 1 and region 2. It's just a numbers game. You have high wolf density and high grizzly bear density, and then you throw in black bears and cats on top of it. You're just not going to have the calf and fawn recruitment to sustain a growing herd. That's just the fact of the matter. Now, what's going on from this side to the east of Montana in 4, 5, and 6, and 7, you have elk growth, elk population booms for the last 2 decades. And why is that? I think part of it is just because of, historically there were elk in the breaks area, and elk are very nomadic and they're going to expand their range. And so over the course of 3 decades, they've expanded their range and they've moved south into 700. And of course, in region 4, there's a lot of elk, part of the breaks. But once again, this is where the problem is because where we have the biggest booms, the greatest number of elk, we have the majority of private land. And so the public land seems crowded, right? That's what we're dealing with, is we're having a lot of the hunters are going to the east to hunt what public land is available. And it seems crowded when you throw in the deer hunters and the bee licenses and the upland hunters. There's just a lot of hunters on the landscape. So if you ever hear somebody say that, yeah, there's all these wolves in Montana, but the elk population has actually grown, but they've grown because the elk populations that have really grown are outside of the grizzly bear and the wolf distribution area. So you just have far less predation and you have all these ideal conditions. And so this is what's interesting too, of how elk are, they're so nomadic and they can move around from region to region. That's why I don't pay too much attention to population counts on a yearly basis. You have to look more at a trend, look at a 5-year trend to see where these elk are actually ending up, because there's all these factors that come into play with where elk are going to summer and winter. So these are the current numbers. So we're at 2,200 elk in region 1, which is up from 5,000 in region 1, which is great. That's great. But we've been killing 250 to 300 wolves every year for the last 14 years. And so in region 1 alone, there's 500 wolves, and it's been about 500 wolves for the last 10 years. And so it's good to see that populations are creeping back since we've started to hunt the wolf. And we've seen that in region 2 as well. There's 24,000 elk in region 2. In 2008, there was 17,800 at the height of the wolf before we were allowed to hunt them. Region 3, the same thing. Look at this. It's gone up to 58,000 from 42,000 from 2008 to present times. So that's a pretty good increase. Okay, so region 6, what happened here? 2008, we had 3,300 elk, and present time we have 2,000 elk. So what happened in region 6? There's no wolves, there's no grizzly bears, there's other predators, coyotes, maybe some lions and stuff. But what we've seen, and once again, this is a big gap. It's hard to really understand the big picture when you're going from a 2008 population to 2024 population without knowing what's going on in between. But I do know for a fact that region 6, north of the river, north of Fort Peck, experienced very severe drought for several years, at least through 2020 through 2023. So what happens when there's drought and you're dealing with elk? Elk need water. They love water. So I believe that a lot of the elk kind of dispersed and they found other places that have more water. Now, region 6, other than, some public along the breaks and Fort Peck and, up along the river, the majority of region 6 is private. So yeah, there's been shoulder seasons. Yeah, there's elk bee licenses. I don't think that alone is going to really knock down a population like that. So once again, elk are nomadic, they're smart, they're very resilient, they're gonna move. They're gonna find places that have water if their current habitat doesn't have water. And that may be a little bit of an explanation why region 4 had seen such a big increase. We're up 36,000 from 21,000. So these elk move around. So yeah, just an interesting little bit there about region 6. I think the drought was the number one cause of that region losing elk. Okay, so lastly, how do we fix this? What I see as the problem here is that we have all these hunters that are focusing their efforts on the east part of the state where there's so little public land. So we have all this public land that the hunters are vacating because there's no animals. So what do we need to do? We need to get hunters back over to the west part of the state. Make this public land more attractive for deer and elk hunting. But what do we need to do with that? We need habitat improvement. We need predator management. We need to look at other reasons that why maybe deer and elk populations are low. And you know, there's always exceptions in both regions. There's still HDs, hunting districts in each region that have good deer and elk populations, pockets of good populations. And so those are the exception. That's not the rule. The rule is overall, 1 and 2 are struggling as a whole with elk and deer numbers. So we do know we have at least 500 wolves in region 1, 300 wolves in region 2. This is the most heavily distributed area of wolves and grizzly bears in the state of Montana. So we need to look at predators, and then we need to look at habitat improvement. In region 1, it's so heavily timbered, so heavily forested. What we'd seen in the 70s, 80s, and 90s is a lot of logging. And what does logging do in these very, very thick areas? It creates habitat. It allows sunlight to get to the valley floor, to the forest floor, and grow feed. Elk are grazers, right? They need graze. They don't do as well in browsing country, and that's mostly what this is. So maybe just something to think about. We need to make these large tracts of public land more attractable to hunters, which means more elk and more deer. And I think that would help a lot when it comes to hunter distribution and just spreading out the pressure a little bit. There's gonna be some more videos on this. I love talking about numbers and populations in my home state of Montana. And we're gonna have another video coming up here too when I discuss, this is a big deal. Every 10 years we lose half of our moose, sheep, and goat tags. So what's going on? We're gonna talk about that in an upcoming video. But if you enjoyed this video, leave me a comment. Obviously, I'm not gonna get to everything. There's so many factors. There's just not 1 or 2 things that are gonna dictate, you know, hunter trends or population trends or harvest rates. It's just such a dynamic flow of what's going on. And I tell you what, I'm not jealous of FWP because they have their hands full. It's hard to keep people happy in the state of Montana when it comes to public land hunters and landowners and landowner tolerance of ungulates. So it's a challenge, and Montana is a specific challenge because it's 70% private. So once again, subscribe, like the video. That it really helps. Thank you guys for watching. Keep your eye out for more of these videos coming up, and I can't wait to talk about moose, sheep, and goat.